Have you ever walked away from a conversation thinking, why couldn't I just say what I meant? You had the idea. You knew exactly what you wanted to express, but somewhere between your mind and your mouth, it dissolved, fragmented into half-sentences, stumbling pauses, and words that didn't quite land. Meanwhile, you've watched other people in the same room command every ear in the space. They open their mouths, and people lean in. They finish a sentence, and the air holds it. That contrast is not about intelligence. It is not about privilege or personality type. It is not a fixed trait you were either born with or without. What separates those two experiences is something far more learnable, far more democratic, and far more transformative than most people realize: the art and science of effective communication. This is not about impressing people with a vast vocabulary. It is not about sounding like a professor at a podium or a politician at a rally. The real goal is something quieter and more powerful: to be heard, to be understood, and to make your presence felt without ever raising your voice or pretending to be someone you're not. To communicate with intelligence means to speak with clarity, connect with warmth, and deliver your message in a way that survives contact with another human mind. The world we live in today makes this more urgent than ever. We are surrounded by noise, social media feeds that refresh before we finish reading them, meetings stacked back to back with no space to breathe, conversations that happen in the margins of distracted attention. In this environment, the people who rise are not necessarily the loudest or the most credentialed. They are the ones who can cut through the noise with precision and intention. They are the ones whose words mean something. Scientific research supports this. Studies conducted at Stanford University have demonstrated that people form initial impressions of others within seconds, sometimes within milliseconds, based almost entirely on vocal tone, word clarity, and the rhythm of speech. Before you've introduced yourself, before anyone has read your resume, before you've even shaken hands, a judgment has been made. Whether you're in a job interview in Singapore, a pitch meeting in London, a town hall in Nairobi, or a casual dinner in Buenos Aires, your voice is your signature. How you speak determines whether doors open, but here is the crucial distinction. Speaking intelligently does not mean using complicated words. In fact, research consistently shows the opposite. Simplicity, used with intention and precision, lands harder than complexity. Think about the leaders who have left permanent marks on human history. Nelson Mandela, whose quiet authority could silence a stadium. Malala Yousafzai, who spoke to the United Nations at 16 and moved the world with plain, fearless sentences. Winston Churchill, whose wartime speeches ran on rhythm and repetition, not abstraction. Aung San Suu Kyi, who communicated across cultural chasms with grace and economy of language. These communicators were not remarkable because they deployed unusual vocabulary. They were remarkable because they knew when to speak and when to go silent, when to tell a story and when to state a fact, how to create weight without volume. Their words carried meaning not from the sound of their voices, but from the clarity of their intention. So where does that leave the rest of us? The people who don't have speechwriters, who haven't trained for years in public speaking, who feel their confidence shrink the moment they realize an important person is listening? The answer is simpler than you might think, but it requires honesty with yourself. Most of us struggle with communication not because we lack intelligence or ideas, but because we've never been taught how to translate thought into speech. We were taught grammar in school. We were taught how to structure an essay, but nobody sat us down and said, here is how to organize a thought before it leaves your mouth. Here is how to use silence. Here is how to make another person feel genuinely heard. Here is how to hold a room not with volume, but with presence. These are the skills this guide is about. Let's start with the brain. Understanding how the human brain processes spoken language gives you an enormous advantage as a communicator. Once you understand why certain speech patterns create comfort and trust while others create anxiety and confusion, you can begin to deliberately engineer the effect your words have on people. The brain, your listener's brain, is not a passive recorder. It is an active prediction machine. When someone speaks to you, your brain is constantly anticipating what comes next, cross-referencing what it hears against what it already knows, and deciding whether to allocate more attention or withdraw it. This process happens unconsciously, in milliseconds, and it is highly sensitive to pattern, rhythm, and clarity. Research from the University of California has shown that the brain processes regular rhythmic speech with natural pauses far more efficiently than dense, rapid, or unstructured speech. The brain essentially relaxes into rhythm. When the pace is steady, when sentences have room to breathe, when the speaker's tone is warm and consistent, the listener's cognitive load decreases, meaning more mental bandwidth is available to actually receive the message. Whereas when a speaker rushes, stumbles, or piles detail upon detail without pause, the listener's brain begins to tire. It starts filtering, and filtered information doesn't stick. This is why the most effective TED speakers in the world, regardless of their native language, their field, or their cultural background, tend to share a common set of rhythmic habits. They pause. They breathe visibly. They do not race through their insights as if afraid of running out of time. They treat each sentence as worth inhabiting for a moment. That is not coincidence. That is strategy. There is another critical layer here. Clarity triggers dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter most commonly associated with reward, motivation, and pleasure. But it is also released when the brain successfully resolves a pattern, when something makes sense. When you hear a clear explanation, a well-constructed analogy, or a sentence that lands exactly right, there is a small neurochemical reward. It feels satisfying. It creates positive associations with the speaker. This is why some people seem to be universally liked in groups, effortlessly respected and listened to, even when they say nothing that others haven't said before. Their way of speaking produces cognitive comfort. Their clarity is pleasurable to receive. Understanding this changes how you should think about your own communication. The goal is not to perform intelligence. The goal is to make it easy, almost pleasurable, for the other person to understand you. Every piece of friction you remove from the listening experience is a step toward making your words matter. Now let's get practical. Slow down. This is the most immediate, highest leverage change most people can make. When stress or excitement enters our system, our breathing shortens and our speech accelerates. This is the moment when sentences collapse, filler words multiply, and listeners start to lose the thread. Deliberately slowing your pace does something physiologically powerful. It signals confidence, not to your audience, but to yourself. Your nervous system begins to regulate, your thinking sharpens, your word choices improve. Researchers at MIT found that speakers who modulate their pace, slowing for emphasis, pausing before important points, are consistently rated as more intelligent and more trustworthy than speakers who maintain a flat, fast delivery. The counterintuitive truth is that slowing down speeds up understanding. Use silence deliberately. This may be the single most undervalued skill in communication. Most people experience silence in a conversation as a failure state, something to be filled, corrected, escaped, so they reach for filler words. You know, like, basically, I mean. These words are not just neutral placeholders. They actively erode the perception of competence. They signal to the listener that the speaker is uncertain, unfocused, or unprepared. Silence, on the other hand, is authoritative. A well-timed pause before an important statement says, "What follows is worth your attention." A pause after an important statement says, "Let that land." A pause when asked a difficult question says, "I'm taking this seriously." None of these are weaknesses. All of them are strengths. Emphasize strategically. Intelligent communicators know which word in a sentence carries the meaning, and they make that word count. Consider this sentence. I never said she took the money. Now say it 7 times, emphasizing a different word each time. The sentence's meaning shifts completely with each iteration. This is not a trick. It is a demonstration of how emphasis shapes perception. Learning to place stress on the right word, not just any word, is one of the subtlest and most powerful tools in a speaker's arsenal. Consider 2 candidates walking into the same job interview at a technology company in Tokyo. Both have nearly identical qualifications. Both are nervous, but one of them fills every pause with "like" and jumps between ideas without connecting them, and ends statements with a rising inflection that sounds like a question, signaling uncertainty. The other pauses before answering, speaks incomplete thoughts, and ends declarative statements with a falling tone that signals conviction. The second candidate is not smarter, but they sound smarter. And in the compressed high-pressure space of a first impression, sounding it and being it are functionally indistinguishable. This is not manipulation. It is alignment, making the outer expression match the inner reality. If you have good ideas, you deserve to have them heard, and making them heard requires more than having them. There is a dimension of intelligent communication that often gets overlooked because it is invisible to the eye, the role of vocal tone in shaping meaning. You can say the phrase, "I'm fine," in a way that makes someone deeply worried about you. You can say it in a way that radiates genuine contentment. The words are identical. The meaning is completely different. The difference lives entirely in tone. Tone carries emotional information that words alone cannot. Research in psycholinguistics has consistently shown that when verbal content and vocal tone contradict each other, listeners tend to trust the tone. The body doesn't lie. The voice doesn't lie. People who say, "I'm absolutely certain about this," while their voice rises at the end and their shoulders curl inward, will not be believed, regardless of what their words say. This means that managing your tone is not a superficial concern. It is central to communicating truth. And truth is the foundation of trust. And trust is the foundation of persuasion. Practically, this means lower your pitch slightly at the end of declarative sentences. This projects certainty. Warm your tone when making emotional appeals or personal connections. Slow and deepen your voice when making your most important point. It signals weight. Do not speak at a uniform pitch throughout. Tonal monotony is the enemy of engagement. The brain disengages from flat stimulation. A final thought for this opening section before we go deeper. Effective communication is not about becoming someone else. It is not about adopting a persona, imitating a mentor, or squeezing yourself into a mold that doesn't fit your personality. The most magnetic communicators in the world are not flawless. They are genuine. They are not performing. They are present. A cracked voice at a moment of real emotion is not a weakness. An imperfect word choice recovered from gracefully is not a failure. A moment of visible thought before answering a hard question is not uncertainty, it is respect. What you are building through every technique in this guide is not a mask. You are building the capacity to let what's already inside you, your intelligence, your perspective, your genuine care for the person across from you, Come through with less interference, less friction, more signal. Because the world doesn't need more people who sound smart. It needs more people who are smart and have finally learned how to show it. The science of clarity, why simple is sophisticated. There is a persistent myth in professional environments, from boardrooms in Frankfurt to lecture halls in Seoul, that using complex language signals expertise, that the more technical your vocabulary, the more credible you appear. That jargon is the currency of authority. This myth is not just wrong, it is counterproductive. The research is unambiguous. Studies published in peer-reviewed psychology journals have repeatedly demonstrated that communicators who use unnecessarily complex language are perceived as less intelligent, not more. This effect, sometimes called the complexity penalty, occurs because complexity creates cognitive friction, and cognitive friction is uncomfortable, and discomfort gets attributed unconsciously to the speaker. Albert Einstein is credited with a principle that has become foundational in science education. If you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. This is not false modesty from a man who revolutionized physics. It is a precise observation about the relationship between understanding and communication. Genuine mastery allows simplification. Surface knowledge requires obfuscation. When a speaker buries their message in technical language, jargon, or convoluted syntax, two things happen. First, the listener's brain allocates processing power to decoding rather than receiving. The cognitive energy that should be used to evaluate your idea is instead used to parse your sentences. Second, the listener begins to feel inadequate, as if they should understand this but don't. And people do not enjoy feeling inadequate. They disengage, they stop listening, and your message, however brilliant, disappears into the noise. Think about the last time you were genuinely gripped by a speaker, not impressed in a detached way, but actually gripped, unable to look away, forgetting your phone existed. Was that speaker using complicated terminology? Almost certainly not. They were almost certainly doing something much harder, making a complex idea feel simple, making an abstract concept feel concrete, making you feel as if you had always known this thing, you just hadn't had the right words for it until now. That feeling, the sensation of being met exactly where you are and taken somewhere new, is the highest achievement of intelligent communication. It requires two things: knowing your subject deeply enough to simplify it, and knowing your listener well enough to calibrate how. To bring this down to something immediately usable, consider a manager at a renewable energy company in São Paulo trying to explain a new operational protocol to her team. She has two options. Option A: the implementation of the revised cross-functional synchronization protocol necessitates a realignment of departmental throughput metrics in accordance with updated sustainability benchmarks. Option B: we're changing how the teams track their progress so that everyone's working toward the same environmental goals. Same information, radically different reception. Option A creates distance. Option B creates understanding. And understanding creates buy-in. And buy-in creates action. This is not dumbing down. This is intelligence in action. Shedding verbal complexity does not mean abandoning precision. Some of the most powerful words in the English language are simple ones, words like trust, fear, change, hope, loss, now. These words carry enormous weight precisely because they are clean. They bypass intellectual filtering and go straight to something more primary. Meanwhile, long phrases often carry less information than short ones. Facilitate an improvement in outcomes is weaker than make things better. Engage in proactive stakeholder communication is weaker than talk to the people involved. The longer versions don't just fail to add meaning, they subtract it. Stripping language down to its load-bearing elements is a discipline. It requires asking for each sentence. Is every word here pulling its weight? If I removed one word, would the meaning suffer? If the answer is no, remove the word. This exercise, practiced consistently, reshapes how you think about language. You begin to see your own verbal habits more clearly, the filler phrases you've been defaulting to, the buffer words you use when you're uncertain, the overqualification that softens your message into mush. The architecture of thought, how structure transforms speech. There is a version of intelligence that never reaches another person, not because it isn't real, but because it was never organized for travel. Ideas that live beautifully in your mind can arrive at someone else's ear as a pile of disconnected fragments, a tangle of insights with no clear thread between them. The listener is left to do the assembly work themselves, and most of the time, they won't bother. This is one of the most common and most fixable communication problems in the world. Not a lack of intelligence, not a lack of vocabulary, a lack of structure. Think about your speech the way an architect thinks about a building. The raw materials, bricks, steel, glass, do not become a building by themselves. They require a plan, a sequence, a logic of arrangement that turns individual components into something habitable, something that works. Your words are your materials. Structure is the design that makes them a building rather than a pile. When your communication has clear structure, something remarkable happens for your listener. Their brain stops working against you. Instead of trying to figure out where you're going, they can relax into the knowledge that you have a destination and focus their energy on the content of the journey. They become passengers instead of navigators, and passengers pay attention. The simplest and most universally effective structure in communication is the three-part arc: opening, development, close. In the opening, you declare your direction. You tell the listener, explicitly or implicitly, what territory you're about to enter. This is not a summary, it is an orientation. It says, here is the map, and here is where we are going. It gives the listener a frame, a cognitive container, within which to place everything that follows. In the development, you unfold your thinking. You present your evidence, your stories, your examples, your reasoning. You move through your ideas in a deliberate sequence, each thought emerging naturally from the one before it. The listener can follow you because there is a path. In the close, you return to your central message with renewed force. Not repetition for its own sake, but the kind of return that proves you are always moving toward something. The close says, this is what I needed you to understand. It is the destination that justifies the journey. This structure exists across cultures, across centuries, across media. It is the skeleton of a sermon and a Supreme Court argument, of a great novel and a 30-second elevator pitch. The reason it persists is that it maps onto how the human brain learns: orientation, exploration, consolidation. The power of three. Within this architecture, one principle deserves special attention: the cognitive power of triads. The human brain has a deep affinity for patterns of three. Researchers in cognitive linguistics have documented this across dozens of languages and cultures. The rule of three appears to be not a stylistic preference, but something closer to a structural feature of how we process and retain information. 3 feels complete. 2 feels unresolved. 4 feels excessive. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Stop, look, and listen. Tell them what you're going to say it, then tell them what you said. The triadic structure is everywhere in the most memorable language, from political speeches to advertising slogans to philosophical maxims, because it works at a neurological level, not just an aesthetic one. As a communicator, this gives you a remarkably simple tool. When you need to make a point memorable, put it in 3 parts. When you're asked a complex question, answer it with 3 reasons. When you're introducing a concept, give it 3 dimensions. Imagine you're in a meeting at a technology firm in Bangalore, and someone asks, what makes a product launch successful? The unstructured answer lists 10 considerations in random order. The structured answer says, in my experience, successful launches come down to 3 things: genuine understanding of the user's problem, a clear differentiation from what already exists, and go-to-market timing that matches where the market actually is. The second answer is not longer. It is not more comprehensive, but it is dramatically more persuasive, more memorable, and more likely to position you as someone worth listening to. Signpost words, the road signs of speech. Another structural tool that intelligent communicators use constantly and invisibly is the signpost. A signpost word or phrase tells the listener where you are in your communication map. It acts as a road sign, indicating transitions, priorities, and direction. Used well, signposts make even complex communication feel effortless to follow. Used poorly, or not at all, even simple communication can feel labyrinthine. Common signposting phrases include first, more. Importantly, let me come back to that in a moment. Here's what I mean by that. The key point is this. To bring this back to the central question, these phrases do double duty. They help the listener navigate, but they also help you navigate. When you are under pressure, in a high-stakes meeting, responding to a challenging question, making a case to a skeptical audience, signpost phrases are an anchor. They give your mind a structure to fall back on, preventing the kind of scatter that stress produces. A senior public health official at the World Health Organization in Geneva once described her approach to high-pressure press briefings this way. I know that whatever chaotic question I'm asked, I can organize my answer into 3 beats. I just need to find my first signpost, and the rest follows. The signpost is the handhold that steadies everything else. Stories as structure. There is one more structural tool that deserves deep attention: the story. The story is humanity's oldest cognitive technology. Long before written language, before philosophy, before systematic science, human beings were telling stories. Not because they lacked the capacity for abstraction, but because stories are how the brain records what matters. Stories encode experience. They activate multiple regions of the brain simultaneously: language, imagery, emotion, motor simulation. Abstract information, by contrast, engages a much narrower neural pathway and fades comparatively quickly. This has a direct implication for how you communicate. Any idea you want someone to remember is better delivered as a story. Any principle you want someone to feel, rather than just intellectually accept, needs a narrative shape. Consider 2 ways of communicating the same idea about organizational resilience. Version A. Effective organizations develop robust adaptive capacity to navigate disruptions in volatile market environments. Version B. A few years ago, a small logistics startup in Helsinki had built their entire business around a single shipping partner. When that partner went bankrupt overnight, most people expected the company to fold within a month. Instead, they had all their cargo on alternative routes within 72 hours. I asked the CEO afterward how they'd managed it. She said, "We spent years rehearsing problems we hoped would never happen." That is what resilience looks like in practice. Both versions communicate the same concept. but only one of them will be remembered at the end of the day. Only one creates an image. Only one produces an emotional response. Only one makes the listener feel the principle rather than just register it. When you build a story into your communication, you are not padding it or taking a detour. You are delivering the central message in the format the human brain is most prepared to receive. Staying on the path. A critical discipline for structured communicators is knowing how to maintain focus. It is easy in the flow of speech to follow a thought down a side road. One detail suggests another. An anecdote expands, a tangent seems relevant, and suddenly you are deep in territory that has nothing to do with your original destination. And neither you nor your listener quite knows how to get back. This is where many communicators lose their audience. Not at the beginning, when attention is fresh. Not at the end, when a strong close can salvage almost anything. In the middle, in the sprawling, under-disciplined middle, where the structure collapses and the listener quietly gives up. The remedy is a simple internal question asked ruthlessly and regularly. Is what I'm about to say advancing my central message? If yes, say it. If no, cut it. Ruthlessly, without sentimentality, regardless of how interesting it seems to you in isolation. This sounds simple. It is not. It requires real-time monitoring of your own speech, which is cognitively demanding, but it is a discipline that can be developed through deliberate practice. Record your own speech. Listen back. Notice where you wandered. Notice the exact moment the structure loosened. The more you do this, the more automatic the monitoring becomes, until it runs in the background of every conversation, every meeting, every presentation, keeping you on the path. Structure reduces anxiety. There is a psychological benefit to structure that is rarely discussed. It reduces the fear of speaking. Much of what people experience as communication anxiety, the racing heart before a presentation, the blank mind moment when an important question is asked, is not fear of people. It is fear of not knowing what comes next, fear of losing the thread, fear of arriving somewhere unintended and not being able to find the way back. Structure eliminates most of that fear at its source. When you know your opening, you have a starting point. When you know your 3 core points, you have a path. When you know you're close, you have a destination. The journey may feel uncertain, but you know it ends somewhere intentional. That knowledge is profoundly calming. A researcher in organizational psychology at Columbia University in New York has spent years studying what distinguishes people who grow under public speaking pressure from those who shrink. Her finding, replicated across industries and cultures, it is almost never raw talent or extroversion. It is almost always preparation of structure. The people who perform well under pressure know the shape of what they are going to say, even if they don't know the exact words. The shape is the safety net. This reframes how we should think about preparation. Most people prepare by rehearsing content, memorizing facts, practicing wording, running through examples. This helps, but the more foundational preparation is structural. What am I saying? In what order? Why that order? And what is the one thing I need the listener to walk away with? Answer those questions clearly, and the specific words will take care of themselves. Organization is respect. One final reason structure matters, and perhaps the most human reason of all. When you organize your communication, you are sending a signal to your listener. I have thought about how to make this easy for you to receive. You are demonstrating that their attention is valuable to you, that you have done the internal work of sorting and sequencing so that they don't have to. Disorganized speech says the opposite. It says, I haven't taken the time to prepare for this conversation. Or, more charitably, I haven't yet developed the skills to organize my thinking before it exits my mouth. Either way, the listener bears the cost. This is not about perfectionism. It is about respect, and people feel it. When a speaker has clearly thought through their communication, there is an almost physical sense of ease in the room. When they haven't, there is friction, a slight tension, an effort required of the audience. Intelligent communication begins not when you open your mouth, but when you organize your thoughts. The words are the final step, not the first. The architecture is built in the mind before it is constructed in speech. The courage to listen. How great speakers are built on great listening. Here is something that most books on communication never tell you. The best communicators in the world are not the most articulate speakers. They are the best listeners. This sounds paradoxical, but it is precisely true. Listening is not the absence of speaking. It is not the passive state you occupy while waiting for your turn to talk. Listening is active. It is effortful. It is a skill that most people have never been explicitly taught and that almost everyone underestimates. And it is the skill that makes every other communication skill work. Here is why. The purpose of communication is not to transmit information. It is to create shared understanding, and shared understanding requires knowing where your listener is, what they know, what they don't know, what they care about, what they fear, what they are hoping you'll say, what they're bracing against. Without that knowledge, you are speaking into a void. You may be technically fluent, logically precise, and rhythmically compelling, but if your message isn't calibrated to your specific listener in their specific context, it glances off them like light off glass. Listening is how you acquire that calibration. When you truly listen to someone, not politely, not strategically, but genuinely, two things happen simultaneously. First, you gather information about their perspective, their emotional state, their unspoken concerns, their underlying needs. Second, you demonstrate to them, through the quality of your attention, that they matter, that their words are landing on fertile ground, that they are being received. The effect of this demonstration is disproportionate to the effort it costs. People who feel genuinely listened to open, they trust more readily, they engage more deeply, they become better partners in the conversation. Their defensiveness decreases. Their willingness to hear your perspective increases. The entire communication dynamic shifts. A behavioral science researcher at the University of Amsterdam spent 5 years studying interactions between negotiators, mediators, and conflict resolution specialists across 3 continents. Her most consistent finding: the individuals who achieved the most durable agreements in business disputes, in family mediation, in international policy contexts, were not the most persuasive arguers. They were the most patient listeners. Listening, she concluded, is not just preparation for speaking. It is itself the most powerful form of communication available. Active listening in practice. Listening well has a technique, just like speaking well does. The first practice is full attention, removing distractions, making eye contact, and genuinely directing your cognitive resources at the person speaking. This sounds obvious. It is surprisingly rare. In most conversations, in offices in Toronto, cafes in Amsterdam, family dinners in Casablanca, people are listening with perhaps 30% of their available attention, while the remaining 70% drafts, responses, monitors the environment, or wanders entirely. The person speaking can feel this. They may not be able to name it, but they feel it. Full attention is a gift. It is experienced as respect. The second practice is reflective listening, paraphrasing back to the speaker what you've understood them to say. Not as a performance, not as a trick, but as a genuine check on comprehension. What I'm hearing is that you feel the timeline is unrealistic, but the concern is less about the deadline itself than about being consulted before it was set. Is that right? this does something remarkable. It tells the speaker that they've been heard accurately, not just registered. And if you've misunderstood, it creates a graceful moment for correction before the conversation builds on false premises. The third practice is listening for what isn't said. This is the most sophisticated level. It requires attending not just to the content of someone's words, but to the emotional texture underneath them. The hesitation before a particular sentence, the way a certain topic produces a shift in tone, the questions they keep circling but never quite asking directly. These signals carry meaning. They tell you what someone is struggling to say, or what they're afraid to say, or what they need you to address but haven't been able to name. Responding to that, not just to the surface content, is what transforms a competent communicator into an extraordinary one. Listening in conflict. One of the most critical applications of listening is in situations of disagreement, which is precisely where most people abandon it. When someone challenges your position, contradicts your statement, or expresses frustration with you, the neurological default is defensive. The brain registers threat and prepares to respond accordingly. Your speech accelerates, your sentences shorten, your tone hardens. You stop truly receiving what the other person is saying and start constructing your rebuttal. This is understandable. It is also almost always counterproductive. The intelligent communicator at this exact moment does the opposite. They slow down. They consciously shift from response mode to reception mode. They ask themselves, what is this person actually trying to communicate? What need or fear is underneath this challenge? And then they ask the other person a version of that question aloud. Help me understand what's driving this concern. I want to make sure I'm actually hearing you. Can you say more about what's bothering you? Before I respond, can I check that I've understood the full picture? These phrases do not signal weakness. They signal intelligence. They signal the kind of self-regulation that most people admire, but rarely see demonstrated in real time. And they frequently de-escalate situations that would otherwise spiral. Because the person in conflict often needs, more than anything, to feel that their position has been truly received. Listening in difficult moments is not a concession. It is a competitive advantage. The confidence equation, speaking from strength without arrogance. Confidence in communication is one of the most misunderstood concepts in professional development. People conflate it with certainty, with dominance, with the absence of vulnerability. They imagine that a confident speaker is someone who never hesitates, never searches for a word, never shows any sign of inner uncertainty. This is wrong. And it is a standard so inhuman that pursuing it produces the opposite of what's wanted. Real communicative confidence has nothing to do with being infallible. It has everything to do with continuing, with not letting imperfections stop you, with believing in the value of what you're saying, even in the moments when the saying is imperfect. The most compelling speakers in the world, from a financial analyst presenting quarterly results in Zurich to an activist addressing a crowd in Lagos, are compelling not because they never stumble, but because they never abandon the message. When they do, the audience does not need you to be flawless. The audience needs you to be present. Body language as a confidence signal. Before a single word is spoken, your body has already communicated. This is not metaphor. The research is clear. A significant proportion of the impression you create in the first moments of an interaction is formed from physical signals: posture, gaze, facial expression, the economy of movement. People read these signals involuntarily and form judgments that are surprisingly difficult to revise once formed. Confident body language is not about performing dominance. It involves a posture that is open and vertical, not rigid but not collapsed, gaze that is steady and inclusive rather than avoidant or scanning, movement that is deliberate rather than fidgety, and hands that are visible and relatively still. These signals do not just communicate confidence to others, they create it in you. Research by social psychologist Amy Cuddy at Harvard Business School demonstrated that adopting open, expansive postures before high-stakes communication actually changes the hormonal balance of the speaker, increasing testosterone associated with confidence and decreasing cortisol associated with stress. Your body is not just the vehicle for your communication, it is part of the message. The vocal dimension of confidence is equally important. The most common confidence failure in speech is the rising inflection at the end of declarative statements. When someone says, "I think this approach could work," with their voice going up at the end as if asking permission, they are signaling uncertainty even if they feel certain. The message says, "I believe in this." The voice says, "Do you agree?" The listener's unconscious brain receives the contradiction and resolves it in favor of the vocal signal. Dropping your pitch at the end of declarative statements is one of the simplest and most powerful adjustments any speaker can make. It signals that you have arrived at a conclusion, not wandered into a question. It tells the listener, "This is what I think. Full stop." This is not about being aggressive or dismissive of others' views. It is about presenting your own views with appropriate conviction. You can drop your pitch at the end of a statement and genuinely remain open to dialogue. These are not contradictory. The inner voice and outer confidence. There is one more dimension of confidence that most communication guides skip entirely: the conversation you have with yourself before and during the act of speaking. The inner dialogue matters enormously. When you walk into a room telling yourself, "I'm going to lose their attention," "I'm not qualified to say this," or "everyone will notice if I stumble," those beliefs are not neutral background noise. They actively shape the communication that follows. They tighten the voice. They accelerate the pace. They produce the rising inflection you were trying to avoid. The inverse is equally true. When you walk in with a genuine belief in the value of what you're bringing, not arrogance, not performance, but genuine faith that you have something worth saying to people who have something worth hearing, your voice changes. Your posture changes. The quality of your attention to the room changes. This is not about faking a mindset you don't feel. It is about cultivating a relationship with your own ideas, about asking yourself regularly and honestly, "Do I actually believe what I'm about to say? Is this message worth the room's time?" If the answer is yes, let your body know. Let your voice know. The confidence will follow the belief. Consider two colleagues both making the same proposal in a boardroom in Cape Town. The first says, "Well, I was kind of thinking, and I'm not sure if this is the right approach, but maybe we could consider possibly looking at a different supplier." The second says, "I want to propose we explore a different supplier. Here's why I think that's worth our attention." Same proposal, opposite impressions. The second speaker does not sound smarter because they are. They sound smarter because they have given themselves permission to take their own idea seriously. Authenticity over perfection. A final thought on confidence. It is built on authenticity, not flawlessness. Copying the style of a speaker you admire is a natural instinct. We learn by imitation. But there is a point at which imitation becomes a mask. And wearing a mask is exhausting, transparent, and ultimately self-defeating. Audiences are sophisticated. They can feel when someone is performing rather than being. They may not be able to articulate what's off, but they sense the gap between the person and the persona. The most sustainable confidence comes from the opposite direction. Not from performing a version of yourself that seems impressive, but from standing fully behind the version of yourself that actually exists. That means owning your particular way of thinking, your particular background, your particular perspective, your voice, with all its idiosyncrasies and imperfections, is not a limitation. It is your most distinctive asset. A voice that cracks at a moment of genuine emotion is not failing. It is communicating something that a polished, controlled delivery cannot, that what is being said matters to the person saying it. And things that matter to the speaker tend to matter to the listener. Speak your truth in your voice, with your body fully aligned behind the message. That is not a communication technique. That is the foundation of all the techniques. And it is available to everyone, regardless of age, background, education, or native language. The language of weakness. How filler words and hedging drain your power. Every communicator has blind spots, verbal habits so deeply embedded that they no longer register as choices. You don't notice you're making them. Neither does your audience consciously. But unconsciously, the accumulated effect lands with surprising precision. One of the most pervasive and damaging of these blind spots is what linguists call weak language, the cluster of hedges, qualifiers, filler sounds, and apologetic constructions that many people use constantly without realizing it. These include words and phrases like, you know, kind of, sort of, basically, I guess. Maybe I'm wrong, but this might be a silly point, but I'm not sure if this is relevant, but individually, each of these seems harmless. Collectively, they hollow out a speaker's authority. They are the verbal equivalent of a shrug, a signal that the speaker is not fully behind what they are saying, is not sure it deserves to be heard, is pre-apologizing for the space their words are about to occupy. The damage these habits do is asymmetric. They cost the speaker far more credibility than most people realize, while offering almost no benefit in return. They do not make the speaker sound more thoughtful or humble. They make the speaker sound uncertain. And uncertainty is contagious. If the speaker doesn't seem confident that their message has value, the listener rapidly catches that doubt. The hedging trap. There is a particular variety of weak language that deserves its own attention. Defensive pre-framing. Defensive pre-framing is the habit of introducing your own idea with a built-in disclaimer before anyone has challenged it. This might be wrong, but I don't know if this is useful, but you've probably already thought of this, but these constructions feel, to the speaker, like a form of social courtesy, a way of softening potential disagreement before it arises. But what they actually do is instruct the listener to discount what follows. The speaker is not just expressing humility. They are actively undermining their own case before making it. Think about the experience from the listener's side. You are in a strategy session with colleagues from a global consulting firm in Dubai. One colleague begins their idea with, "This is probably not useful, and I might have the wrong end of this entirely, but maybe we could consider a slightly different approach." Another colleague begins theirs with, "I want to put a different option on the table." The first speaker may have the better idea, but they have already instructed the room not to take it seriously. The second speaker has done the opposite. The irony is that defensive pre-framing is almost never perceived as humility. It is perceived as a lack of conviction, and a lack of conviction in the speaker produces a lack of conviction in the audience. Where filler words come from. Understanding the psychological source of filler words and hedging helps make them easier to address. These habits almost always originate from the same place. Discomfort with silence, combined with a brain that processes ideas, slightly slower than it wants to speak. The word is not a random noise. It is the sound of a brain that is not yet ready to speak, but feels pressure to be. It is a placeholder for thought, the verbal equivalent of keeping a hand raised while you work out what to say. The solution is not to think faster. The solution is to become comfortable with the alternative, silence. A pause, 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, feels to the speaker like an eternity, a gaping void that the audience must be screaming to fill. But in reality, a brief pause is experienced by the listener as control, as deliberateness, as confidence. The listener does not hear a void. They hear a speaker taking their message seriously enough to choose the right words for it. In fact, the most authoritative communicators in history, from ancient orators to contemporary thought leaders, have consistently shared one vocal habit: the strategic pause. They hold the silence before a key statement. They sit in it after a key statement. They use it as punctuation, as emphasis, as invitation. A room of 300 people will lean in together toward a speaker who has mastered the pause. The silence itself becomes magnetizing. Practice this deliberately. In your next meeting or conversation, when you feel the impulse to fill space with or basically, instead, breathe, pause, and then speak. It will feel unnatural at first. Do it anyway. Watch what happens in the room. Strong starts. One of the highest leverage places to eliminate weak language is at the very beginning of what you say. Opening sentences carry disproportionate weight. They set the frame for everything that follows. A weak opening, hedged, apologetic, or buried in qualifications, tells the audience to expect more of the same. A strong opening, direct, grounded, purposeful, creates forward momentum that carries the rest of the communication on its current. Compare these openings for the same basic idea. Weak. So, I was thinking, and I'm not sure this is quite right, but maybe we should, think about approaching this differently? I don't know, just a thought. Strong. I want to propose a different approach. Here's the thinking behind it. The second opening is not more confident because it uses better vocabulary. It is more confident because it assumes, from the first syllable, that what follows deserves to be in the room. It does not ask permission to exist. It simply arrives. You can develop a small repertoire of strong opening constructions and deploy them habitually. Here's my perspective on this. The key point I want to make is this. I want to bring a specific concern to the table. What I've been thinking about is this. These are not scripts. They are launch pads, structures that give your message momentum from its first word. Self-monitoring. The recording exercise. The most effective tool for becoming aware of your weak language habits is also the most uncomfortable one: listening to yourself. Record yourself speaking. In a meeting, a phone call, a casual conversation, a rehearsal. Then listen to the recording with a specific focus. Count the filler words. Track the hedges. Notice the rising inflections. Notice the points where your voice drops in volume, as if hoping the sentence won't be heard. Most people find this exercise deeply uncomfortable the first time. That discomfort is useful. It is the gap between how you imagine yourself sounding and how you actually sound. Closing that gap requires first seeing it clearly, and the recording is a mirror that your internal experience cannot provide. After 2 or 3 sessions of this kind of deliberate listening, something begins to shift. You start catching yourself in real time. The pause before an gets longer. The impulse to hedge gets recognized before it becomes words. Gradually, the self-monitoring becomes internalized. It moves from deliberate effort to background process, until strong language becomes not an achievement, but simply your default. This is how habits are replaced, not by willpower alone, but by awareness, compounding over time into instinct. Language strength in personal relationships. It would be a mistake to think of these principles as relevant only to professional settings, boardrooms, presentations, formal meetings. The impact of language strength in personal relationships is equally profound and perhaps more intimate. When you communicate with conviction and clarity in your personal life with a partner, a parent, a close friend, you are not performing. You are offering the other person the respect of directness. You are saying, through your language, this relationship is worth my full presence, not a hedged and qualified version of it. Compare. I sort of feel like maybe you don't really listen to me sometimes. I don't know. Maybe I'm imagining it. Versus, I need to tell you something important. I don't feel heard in our conversations lately. Can we talk about that? The first version protects itself from confrontation at the cost of communicating nothing clearly. The second version is honest, direct, and respectful, and gives the other person something real to respond to. It takes courage, but it also creates the conditions for real connection. Vague communication produces vague relationships. Direct communication, warm but clear, produces real ones. Strong language in all contexts is ultimately an act of respect for the message, for the listener, and for the truth of what you actually think and feel. Under pressure, communicating when the stakes are high. Normal conditions are easy. Any communicator can look competent when there is no pressure, no time constraint, no audience, no consequence. The real test of a communication skill set is what it produces under fire. A high-stakes presentation to senior leadership. An unexpected question in a live Q&A. A confrontation that escalates faster than you anticipated. A negotiation that suddenly shifts against you. A moment when the camera is on, the room is watching, and your brain, which has been reliable all day, suddenly goes absolutely blank. These are the moments that define your reputation as a communicator, and these are the moments that, for most people, are least prepared for. The good news is that high-pressure communication is not a different skill from ordinary communication. It is the same skill, tested under more demanding conditions, which means all the practices described in this guide, structure, pacing, silence, clarity, listening, are your preparation for exactly these moments. The discipline you build in low-stakes environments is the reserve you draw on when the stakes are highest, but there are also specific adjustments that help when pressure arrives. Slow down before you speed up. The body's stress response, elevated heart rate, shortened breath, hyperactivated attention, tends to accelerate speech. Words come faster, sentences get shorter, pauses disappear. The speaker starts racing through their content, not because they want to, but because the nervous system has elevated into urgency mode. The single most effective counter to this is conscious deceleration. Immediately recognize the acceleration when it happens. Name it internally if you need to. I'm going faster than I want to. Then deliberately introduce one pause, just one, before your next sentence. That pause breaks the cycle. It brings your breathing down slightly. It signals to your nervous system that you are not, in fact, in immediate danger. It recalibrates. From there, continue with slightly more space between your thoughts, not dramatically, not so much that the conversation loses energy, just enough that you are speaking from thought rather than ahead of it. The blank mind, what to do when words disappear. Almost every communicator has experienced it, the moment when, mid-sentence or mid-thought, the words simply stop. The screen goes blank. You're in front of a room of executives in a glass-walled conference room in Seoul, and the next sentence, which you knew perfectly 3 minutes ago, has simply ceased to exist. This experience is normal. It happens to everyone, including people whose names you associate with brilliance and eloquence. The variable is not whether it happens, but how you respond when it does. The wrong response is to panic, fill the void with rapid filler words, and accelerate into a half-formed sentence that trails away into nothing. This makes the blankness visible and amplifies it. The right response is simpler and more courageous. Acknowledge the pause, stay in your body, and use a bridging phrase to either return to your last clear point or recalibrate to your next one. Let me come back to that from a slightly different angle. The key point I want to make sure I've conveyed is this. Before I go further, let me confirm I've been clear about the central idea. These phrases do three things simultaneously. They give your mind a moment to reorganize. They reassure the audience that you are in control of the communication, even if the precise thread was momentarily dropped. And they redirect attention to your message rather than to your moment of difficulty. In the rare cases where the blank is truly total and no bridging phrase will serve, honesty is more effective than performance. "I've lost my thread. Give me one moment," said calmly, with a brief pause and a composed return. This is not a failure. It is a demonstration of exactly the kind of composed self-regulation that high-pressure situations demand. The unexpected question. One of the most consistently nerve-wracking experiences in professional communication is the question you didn't prepare for, the one that arrives from a direction you weren't watching, that touches a gap in your knowledge or a vulnerability in your argument, that requires a response you haven't pre-built. The temptation is to either answer immediately, producing something unreliable, or admit you don't know and apologize for it, which is often stronger than needed. The most effective approach is a middle path. Acknowledge, pause, and respond deliberately. Acknowledge the question, briefly, genuinely, to signal that you've heard it and are treating it with respect. "That's an important question. I want to give that the answer it deserves." Then pause. Not a long, uncomfortable pause, just 2 or 3 seconds of visible thought. Then answer. Even if your answer is partial, even if it contains an acknowledgement of limitation. What I can say with confidence is this. Beyond that, I'd want to verify before I commit to a specific answer. But here's my current thinking. This construction is not weakness. It is the kind of epistemic honesty that inspires more trust in the long run than false certainty. A diplomat at the United Nations, when asked how she handles questions that catch her completely off guard, said something that has become a touchstone for communicators across disciplines. "I never pretend to know what I don't, but I always know what I'm for." And that's always enough to begin. Breathing as a communication tool. One of the most consistently overlooked tools in high-pressure communication is breath. Breath is both the physiological foundation of speech, you cannot produce sound without it, and a direct regulator of the nervous system's stress response. When breath is shallow and rapid, the nervous system registers alarm. When breath deepens and slows, the nervous system begins to regulate. This means that how you breathe before and during a high-stakes communication directly affects the quality of that communication, not metaphorically, physiologically. Before walking into a high-stakes conversation, presentation, or meeting, take 3 deliberate breaths, deeper than your resting breath, slower than your stress breath. Let the exhale be longer than the inhale. This is not a mystical practice. It is a physical intervention with documented effects on vocal quality, cognitive clarity, and the body language signals you send to the room before you speak a word. During the communication itself, use your pauses as breath moments. Every pause is an opportunity to reset, to let the lungs fill, the voice stabilize, and the mind reconnect to the message. Speaking on a full breath produces a fuller, steadier, more resonant voice. Speaking on depleted breath produces a thin, rushed quality that signals exactly the kind of strain you're trying to conceal. Breathe. Your audience will hear the difference, even if they never know why. Empathy under fire. There is one more dimension of high-pressure communication that separates merely competent performers from genuinely exceptional ones: the capacity to remain empathically present when everything in the environment is pushing you towards self-protection. When you are nervous, stressed, challenged, or caught off guard, the instinct is to turn inward, to monitor yourself, manage your own performance, protect your own position. This is natural. It is also the single most reliable way to lose the room. The most effective redirect is external. Move your focus from yourself to the other person. What does this person actually need from this conversation? What is making them push back? What would make this exchange genuinely useful for them? These questions do not just produce better communication, they produce a form of psychological relief, because they shift the burden from the anxiety of being judged to the purposefulness of being useful. Ironically, the moment you stop trying to manage how you're perceived and start genuinely attending to the other person, you become more compelling. You become present, and presence, that quality of being fully, visibly here, with full attention and no part of the mind elsewhere, is the most magnetic quality a communicator can possess. Every high-pressure situation contains an invitation to disappear into your own anxiety or to become more fully present. The second path is harder. It is also the only one that leaves the room with what you came to give them. The art of persuasion. Moving people without manipulating them. There is a version of persuasion that most people distrust, and rightly so. It is the kind that works through pressure, through manufactured urgency, through emotional manipulation, or through the deliberate distortion of facts. It is the kind that treats the listener as a target to be hit rather than a person to be engaged. It produces compliance. Occasionally, it never produces trust. Then there is the other kind. Genuine persuasion is one of the most sophisticated and humane skills available to a communicator. It operates not by overriding the other person's judgment, but by informing and engaging it. It does not bulldoze resistance. It dissolves it, not through trickery, but through the patient work of understanding what the other person actually needs, believes, and fears, and constructing a communication that speaks honestly and directly to all, or three. This kind of persuasion is available to everyone. It does not require a silver tongue, a dramatic personality, or years of training in rhetoric. It requires something more demanding and more rewarding, the genuine will to understand before you attempt to be understood. Trust is the foundation. Before any persuasive technique has any effect, one thing must exist. The listener must trust you. Trust is not the same as liking. You can trust someone you disagree with. You can fail to trust someone you personally enjoy. Trust, in the context of communication, is a specific belief. This person is being honest with me. They know what they're talking about, and they are not working against my interests. When that belief is present, your words carry weight. When it is absent, even the most logically impeccable argument produces resistance. People do not evaluate arguments from a neutral starting point. They evaluate them through the lens of their relationship with the speaker. A trusted speaker's claims are given generous benefit of the doubt. An untrusted speaker's claims are scrutinized for hidden agendas. This means that the work of persuasion begins long before the moment of persuasion. It is built in every interaction, every instance of following through on what you've said, every demonstration of genuine listening, every acknowledgement of complexity or limitation rather than oversimplification for effect. Trust is the accumulated capital of honest communication, and it is spent in the moments when you need someone to take a leap with you. One practical implication: in situations where trust is uncertain or newly established, it is worth making it visible. Rather than launching immediately into your argument, briefly acknowledge the relationship context. I want to be upfront about where I'm coming from on this. I should say that I have a stake in this outcome, and I want to be transparent about what that is. Voluntary transparency, especially regarding your own limitations or interests, does more for trust than any amount of polished rhetoric. The emotional architecture of persuasion. There is a widespread assumption in professional environments, from law offices in New York to engineering firms in Munich, that the most persuasive communication is purely rational. The best argument, best supported by the clearest evidence, presented in the most logical structure, wins. This assumption is almost entirely wrong. Decades of research in behavioral economics, neuroscience, and decision psychology have converged on a consistent finding. Human beings do not make decisions rationally and then justify them emotionally. They make decisions emotionally and then justify them rationally. The logical argument you present does not persuade. It provides the justification that the person needs after they have already been moved by something felt. This is not a critique of human intelligence. It is a description of how human minds actually work, and understanding it makes you a far more effective communicator. The implication is that any persuasive communication must connect to something the listener cares about, not just something they find logically valid. Values, not just facts. Stories, not just statistics. The concrete human consequence, not just the abstract principle. A climate scientist at a research center in Oslo might present the most rigorous data on ocean temperature changes to a room full of policymakers and move no one to action. The same scientist, describing what those changes will mean for a specific community she visited in the Pacific Islands, the families she met, the children whose futures are written in those numbers, moves the room. The facts are identical. The emotional connection is not. You do not manipulate by making your message emotionally resonant. You serve the truth by presenting it in the form the human mind can most fully receive. Know your listener's world. The most powerful persuasive move available to any communicator is also the most underutilized. Understanding in genuine depth the world of the person you are trying to persuade. What do they want? What are they afraid of? What do they already believe about this topic? What past experiences color their perspective? What would they need to see or hear to feel genuinely safe moving in the direction you are proposing? These are not rhetorical questions, they are research questions. And the research is done through listening, observing, and asking. When you actually understand the listener's world, your communication changes in a fundamental way. You stop presenting your argument and start presenting their argument for your position, showing them not why you believe this, but why they should, given everything they already know and value. This is not dishonest. It is the highest form of communication intelligence, the ability to translate your perspective into the language of another person's reality. A product manager at a digital health company in Singapore described her most important communication lesson this way. I used to go into every pitch talking about our product's features. Then I realized no one in the room cared about features. They cared about the problem those features solved, but only if it was their problem. The day I stopped talking about what we built and started talking about what they were struggling with, everything changed. The structural logic of persuasion. Beyond the emotional architecture, persuasive communication also needs a clear logical structure, because even emotionally engaged listeners need a rational pathway to their conclusion. The feeling opens the door, the argument walks through it. The classic persuasion structure moves through three phases: establishing the problem, presenting the solution, calling to action. In the problem phase, you create resonance. You demonstrate that you understand what the listener is experiencing, not in a manipulative, manufactured way, but genuinely. You name the frustration, the gap, the unresolved difficulty, and you do so in language specific enough that the listener feels recognized rather than just addressed. In the solution phase, you present your case, clearly, confidently, supported by evidence that is specific rather than vague. Not "studies show," which sounds evasive, but research published last year at Johns Hopkins found specifically that not "this approach tends to work," but when this approach was used by a team in Barcelona working on a similar challenge, here is exactly what happened. Specificity is credibility. Vagueness is the enemy of trust. In the call to action phase, you make the next step feel easy, clear, and safe. Persuasion fails most often, not because it fails to convince, but because it fails to convert. The listener agrees in principle, but nothing changes because the path forward is unclear. The close of persuasive communication must answer, "What specifically, now?" One step, concrete, achievable, low in perceived risk. Questions as persuasion. One of the most counterintuitive tools in the persuader's repertoire is the question. Most people approach persuasion as an act of assertion. "I believe X. Here is why. Please agree." But the listener's psychology works differently. What people are told, they can accept or reject. What people discover for themselves, they own. And questions are the instrument through which you guide discovery. A well-placed, open question does not extract information. It creates a moment of genuine reflection in the listener, a moment in which they engage with a perspective they might otherwise have received passively or defensively. What would it mean for the team if this problem stayed unresolved for another year? What would your ideal outcome look like, setting aside what you think is possible? What would change for you if the barrier you mentioned weren't there? These questions do not push. They open. They invite the listener into a process of thinking that, when done honestly, tends to move in the direction of solutions. And solutions arrived at through one's own thinking feel owned rather than imposed. The art is asking genuine questions, not rhetorical weapons masquerading as curiosity, but actual invitations to thought. Listeners are perceptive. They know the difference. The moment a question is felt as a trap, it closes rather than opens. Offering alternatives. There is a final persuasion principle that runs counter to the instinct of most communicators, offering real choices. The instinct, when you have a recommendation or a preferred outcome, is to advocate for it singularly and exclusively, to present your answer as the answer and to defend it against alternatives. This instinct is understandable, but it often produces the opposite of what you want, because it puts the listener in a binary position, agree or disagree. And agreement, reached through binary pressure, is fragile. It does not carry conviction. It is not owned. Offering genuine alternatives, not false choices, but real options with honestly described trade-offs, does something different. It positions you as trustworthy because you are demonstrating that you've considered more than your preferred path. It involves the listener in the decision, which gives them ownership of the outcome. And it frequently results in a better outcome than your original preference because the listener's perspective reveals constraints and opportunities you weren't aware of. I see two realistic approaches here, and I genuinely don't think one is obviously better than the other. It depends on what you prioritize. Let me walk you through both. This construction is not weakness. It is sophisticated communication. It says, I am a partner in solving this problem, not a vendor with a pitch. Perception, management, the invisible layer of all communication. We have spent much of this guide on the technical dimensions of effective communication: structure, pacing, silence, vocabulary, confidence, listening, persuasion. These are real skills, genuinely learnable, and transformatively powerful when practiced with consistency and intention. But there is a layer beneath all of them. A layer that explains why two people can use identical words in identical situations and produce radically different effects. A layer that determines whether your communication is received as you intended or received as something else entirely. That layer is perception management. Perception management is not spin. It is not the manipulation of reality through dishonest framing or strategic omission. At its best, it is the sophisticated understanding that what matters in communication is not just what you say, but what the other person hears, feels, and understands. And that gap between what you intend and what they receive is the true frontier of communicative excellence. The gap between intent and impact. Here is the fundamental insight at the heart of perception management. The meaning of a communication is not what the speaker intends, it is what the listener receives. This is not a philosophical abstraction, it is a practical reality with real consequences in every human interaction. You can be entirely sincere, completely honest, and logically unimpeachable, and still be profoundly misunderstood. Not because your listener is foolish, but because they are bringing their own filters to the exchange, their prior experiences, their emotional state in that moment, their cultural background, their unconscious associations with your tone, your word choices, your posture. A manager who prides himself on directness tells a team member their proposal needs significant revision. His intention, honest, helpful feedback. Her experience, dismissal, criticism, erosion of confidence. The manager goes home feeling he did his job. The team member goes home wondering whether she has a future in the organization. Same words, radically different realities. This gap is not unusual. It is the normal condition of human communication. The question is whether you are aware of it and whether you take responsibility for bridging it. Taking responsibility for the listener's experience does not mean being responsible for their every emotional reaction. It means recognizing that your job as a communicator is not complete when you have transmitted your intended message. It is complete only when you have confirmed, through attention, through questions, through observation, that the message has been received in the spirit in which it was sent. Reading the room. One of the most important perceptual skills for any communicator is what professionals in high-stakes fields call reading the room, the capacity to continuously monitor the emotional and attentional state of your audience and adjust your communication accordingly. This is not an abstract talent. It is an observable, learnable practice. Reading the room means noticing when bodies shift in their seats, usually a signal of disengagement or discomfort, when eye contact breaks, drifting attention or internal objection, when someone nods too vigorously, sometimes agreement, sometimes an unconscious attempt to move past a point, when the energy in the space drops or lifts. These signals do not come with labels. They require interpretation, and interpretation can be wrong. The key is to treat them as questions rather than conclusions, prompts for a small adjustment or a check-in, not certainties to act on without verification. I want to pause and check in. Does this framing make sense, given where you are? I notice we've covered a lot of ground quickly. Is there a point I should double back on? Before I continue, I want to make sure I've actually addressed what's most important to you. These check-ins are not signs of uncertainty. They are signs of communicative intelligence, the recognition that your audience's experience of the communication is as important as the content of the communication itself. Cultural dimensions of perception. Any guide to perception management that ignores cultural context is incomplete. What is perceived as confidence in one culture may be perceived as aggression in another. What reads as collaborative openness in one context may read as indecision or weakness in another. Eye contact that signals respect and engagement in one cultural setting may feel invasive or disrespectful in another. The rhythm of turn-taking in conversation, the appropriate amount of silence before responding, the meaning of nodding, the weight given to indirect versus direct communication. All of these vary significantly across cultural settings, and all of them shape the perception your communication creates. This does not mean abandoning your own communication style when working across cultures. It means developing the perceptual sensitivity to recognize when your default signals may be landing differently than you intend, and having the flexibility to adjust. A senior executive at a multinational financial services firm who has spent 20 years managing teams across 6 continents describes her approach this way. I don't try to become someone different in different cultural contexts, but I try to listen to how my words are landing, not just how I'm delivering them. The adjustment is usually small, a little more space here, a different framing there, but it changes everything about whether I'm actually understood. The strategic self. Managing how you are perceived over time. Perception management is not an event. It is not something that happens in a single conversation, presentation, or negotiation. It is a continuous process, one that unfolds across every interaction, every response, every choice of words over months and years. The communicator who understands this thinks not just about what to say, but about what impression I am building across time. Your professional reputation is not a summary of your qualifications. It is the accumulated perception that others have formed through direct and indirect experience of how you communicate. The colleague who is always spoken of as someone you can trust to be direct did not earn that description in a single meeting. They earned it through a consistent pattern of direct communication, maintained even when directness was uncomfortable, even when softening would have been easier, even when the audience wasn't positioned to reward it immediately. This means that every conversation is a deposit in one account or a withdrawal from another. The question is, which account are you building? Consistency and credibility. The single most powerful perception-building behavior available to any communicator is consistency. Consistency is not rigidity. It does not mean saying the same things in the same way, regardless of context. It means that the values your communication reflects, honesty, clarity, respect for the listener, the willingness to be direct, remain stable across different contexts, different audiences, and different pressures. Inconsistency is perceived as unreliability. When someone is warm and collaborative in informal settings but evasive and defensive in formal ones, people notice, even if they cannot articulate precisely what feels off. When someone speaks confidently about their own ideas but suddenly becomes vague and uncommitted when challenged, the inconsistency registers as a credibility problem. Trust, once eroded by inconsistency, takes far longer to rebuild than it took to build in the first place. Consistency, on the other hand, compounds. Each interaction in which you communicate with clarity and integrity adds to a growing perception of reliability. Over time, this creates something extraordinarily valuable, the benefit of the doubt. The person whose communication is consistently trustworthy is given interpretive grace when they are misunderstood. Their intentions are assumed to be good. Their ideas are received generously. This is not luck. It is the return on sustained investment. The silence you keep perception management is not only about what you communicate, it is equally about what you choose not to communicate, and how that choice is perceived. In many organizational cultures, there is a pressure to fill every silence, have an opinion on every question, and demonstrate engagement through constant verbal output. This pressure produces a great deal of communication that adds little value, and often subtracts it, by diluting the signal of the communicator's genuine thinking. Intelligent communicators know the strategic value of selective silence. They speak less than they might, so that what they do say carries weight. They do not offer an opinion on every question, so that when they do offer one, it is heard as considered rather than reflexive. They allow others to speak, genuinely, fully, before adding their own voice, so that when they speak, they are responding to what was actually said rather than to what they anticipated would be said. This is not passivity, it is discipline, and it is perceived consistently as a marker of senior-level thinking, the sign of a person who has learned that every word is a choice, and that the choices aggregate into a reputation. The Japanese concept of ma, the meaningful pause, the productive silence, the space between notes that gives music its shape, offers a useful lens here. In communication, as in music, what you don't say defines the significance of what you do say. Master the silence, and you master the message. Framing, the invisible architecture of meaning. Of all the tools available to a perception manager, perhaps the most powerful, and the least visible, is framing. A frame is the context within which information is interpreted. It is the lens through which a fact, a situation, or a proposal is understood. Identical information, placed in different frames, produces radically different perceptions. Consider, a pharmaceutical company announces that its new drug fails to cure the underlying condition it targets. Framed as a failure, this is damaging news. Framed as a discovery, we now know with precision what this molecule does not do, which significantly narrows the search space for what will. It is a scientific advance. The facts are identical. The frame transforms their meaning. This is not spin. It is the honest selection of the most accurate and useful interpretive context. Most situations contain multiple true framings. The choice of which frame to use is not a choice between truth and falsehood. It is a choice between different aspects of a complex truth. The communicator who understands framing chooses the frame that most accurately reflects the full reality while creating the conditions for productive response. In practice, framing works through the language you use to introduce an idea before you present it. "I want to flag a risk we haven't discussed" creates a different frame than "I want to open up a dimension of this that I think we've been underinvesting attention in." Both might be introducing the same concern. The second frame invites curiosity. The first invites defensiveness. Framing also works through analogy and metaphor. When the human mind encounters something new or complex, it unconsciously reaches for an existing structure to map it onto. The frame you provide, the analogy or metaphor you choose, becomes the structure the listener uses to understand and remember what you've said. Choose it with care. The long game of authentic reputation. There is a temptation, in any discussion of perception management, to hear a prescription for strategic self-presentation, for the calculated management of impressions in pursuit of desired outcomes, and there is a version of perception management that functions this way, and that is ultimately self-defeating. The reason it is self-defeating is simple. People are perceptive. Over time, across multiple contexts, in unguarded moments, the difference between authentic communication and performed communication becomes visible. The person who manages perceptions through performance eventually faces attacks. The mounting cognitive load of maintaining a constructed image, the growing risk of a context that breaks the performance, and the subtle but pervasive sense in their audience that something does not quite add up. The sustainable form of perception management is not the management of impressions, it is the management of actual behavior, the disciplined, ongoing work of becoming someone whose communication is genuinely worthy of the perceptions you want to create. This is harder than impression management. It is also the only version that works at scale, over time, across the full complexity of a life and a career. Which means the deepest work of communication is not technical, it is character work. It is the ongoing practice of becoming someone who genuinely listens, genuinely means what they say, genuinely considers the impact of their words on others, and genuinely cares about the shared understanding that communication is meant to create. From that foundation, the techniques described in this guide are not tricks. They are the outward expression of inward orientation. They are the skills through which an authentic person becomes an effective communicator. Putting it all together, a framework for lifelong growth. We have covered an enormous amount of territory in this guide. Let us take a moment to bring it into coherent shape, not as a checklist, but as a living framework for ongoing development. The core insight that underlies everything here is this: the reality of communication is not what you intend, but what the other person receives. This is simultaneously humbling and empowering. Humbling, because it means your work as a communicator is never fully done. There is always a gap between intention and reception, and it is always your job to work on closing it. Empowering, because it means that communication mastery is not a fixed destination. It is a continuous practice that rewards every investment, at every level of development, at every stage of life. The daily practice mastery does not arrive in a seminar. It does not come from reading a guide, however comprehensive, or watching a lecture, however insightful. It arrives through daily practice, small, consistent, deliberate choices in ordinary conversations that compound over months and years into genuine skill. Here are the practices most worth building. Listen before you speak. In every conversation today, set a quiet internal intention. I will understand before I respond. Not strategically, not to gather ammunition, but genuinely as if the other person's perspective contains something worth knowing. Because it does. Record yourself. Once a week, record a conversation, a presentation, or even a practice session of speaking aloud. Listen back with specific questions. Where did I rush? Where did I hedge unnecessarily? Where did my voice drop or rise in ways I wasn't aware of? What words could I have replaced with stronger or simpler ones? This practice, maintained consistently, is one of the most accelerated forms of communicative development available. Rehearse structure. Before important conversations, a difficult discussion with a colleague in Johannesburg, a proposal to a client in Vienna, a personal conversation that has been difficult to initiate, spend 5 minutes thinking through the structure. Not memorizing words, but clarifying. What is my central message? What are the 3 things that support it? What is the one thing I need the other person to understand by the end? Structure in advance produces clarity in the moment. Expand deliberately. Each week, expose yourself to one great communicator you haven't heard before. A TED Talk from a speaker in a field outside your own. A podcast interview with a leader from a culture different from yours. A speech from a historical figure you've never studied. Listen not for content, but for method. How do they pace themselves? What do they do with silence? How do they use stories? How do they close? Each observation is a tool you can borrow, adapt, and make your own. Seek feedback. Ask one person you trust, a colleague, a mentor, a friend who will be honest, to tell you one specific thing about how you communicate that they think is limiting you. Not a general compliment, a specific, actionable observation. This requires vulnerability. It is also one of the fastest paths to growth available. The vocabulary of growth. One specific dimension of development that rewards sustained attention is vocabulary, not in the sense of accumulating difficult words, but in the sense of expanding the range of precise, powerful, human-scale words available to you. Every week, identify 2 or 3 words that seem to you more accurate or more resonant than the words you currently default to. Not more obscure, more precise. The difference between scared and apprehensive and dread is not complexity, it is accuracy. Each word captures a different shade of the same territory. Having access to all 3 means being able to communicate the precise texture of an experience rather than gesturing vaguely in its direction. Read widely in fiction and nonfiction across genres and cultures. The best writers are the most precise users of language, and reading them develops a feel for precision that translates directly into speech. A novelist from Lagos and a journalist from Reykjavik and a scientist from Kyoto will each model different relationships to language, different rhythms, different levels of abstraction, different ways of making the specific resonate with the universal. All of them are worth learning from. Notice the language of people whose communication you find compelling, in life, in media, in literature, and ask specifically, what are they doing that I am not? The answer will be different for every person you study and every person studying them. This is the nature of developing a personal communicative voice. It is assembled from 1,000 specific observations synthesized into something that, over time, becomes genuinely yours, the foundation beneath the framework. Everything in this guide, the science of clarity, the architecture of structure, the practice of listening, the discipline of confident language, the tools of persuasion, the sophistication of perception management, rests on a single foundation. That foundation is genuine care for the person you are speaking with, not performed care, not strategic care, genuine interest in whether this specific person, in this specific moment, is actually receiving what you are trying to give them. Genuine curiosity about what they think, what they feel, what they need that you might be able to provide. Genuine respect for their time, their intelligence, and their capacity to receive the truth if it is offered with consideration. When that care is present, the techniques in this guide are expressions of it. They are the specific ways that care becomes visible, through listening that is real enough to shape what you say next, through clarity that respects the listener's time, through confidence that invites rather than intimidates, through persuasion that serves rather than exploits. When that care is absent, the techniques become hollow. They become tricks, and tricks eventually are seen through. This is why the greatest communicators across history, the figures who have changed minds, moved hearts, built trust across difference, and created understanding where there was only confusion, have never been remembered for their technique. They have been remembered for their presence, their humanity, their evident belief that the person across from them mattered. That belief is the first and last word of intelligent communication. Everything else is in service of it. A closing word. What you owe the world. You began this guide, perhaps, thinking about communication as a professional skill, something to improve for career advancement, for better relationships, for greater effectiveness in the contexts where you are already operating. That is a completely valid reason to develop these skills, and the return on that investment is real. But there is a larger frame within which to hold all of this. The world is not short of words. It is flooded with them. In every language, on every platform, at every hour of the day and night, pouring in from every direction at a volume that would have been unimaginable to any previous generation. What the world is desperately short of is understanding, genuine, careful, mutual understanding across the divides of culture, experience, belief, and background that define so much of contemporary life. Every person who develops the capacity to communicate with genuine clarity, genuine listening, and genuine respect for the reality of another person's experience is making a contribution to the shrinking of those divides, not in a grand, abstract sense, but in the concrete, daily, person-by-person sense that is the only way anything actually changes. You have a voice. You have perspectives that no one else in the world holds in quite the same configuration. You have experiences that illuminate truths that cannot be illuminated any other way. The world does not need those perspectives to be perfect. It needs them to be heard, and that requires the work of becoming someone who can communicate them clearly, honestly, and with full respect for the person on the other side. That is what this guide is ultimately about. Not performance, not impression management, not the acquisition of a polished surface. It is about closing the gap between what you mean and what is heard, between who you are and who comes through when you speak, between the communication you are capable of and the communication you have been delivering. Close that gap. Your voice matters. So does the gap.